Robert, let's. I mean, they're all going to merge together, but let's start with the latest on the Trump raid, the redacted affidavit, which shows it shows nothing. You got the David A. Frenches of the universe who are saying, "Oh my goodness, this." I came to the conclusion that he was illegally holding documents, and this affidavit confirms just that. And the rest they have to redact it for preservation of the investigation. Where do we start? I mean, what's your take on the affidavit that they released redacted?
So yeah, I mean, it was very redacted. So now the redactions itself has become a meme. Trump himself put out a meme that says, "Here's what they really found at my house in the raid," and it was everything's redacted except "Make America Great Again." So even Trump was having fun with it. Joe Biden falling up the redacted steps, things like so. I mean that's going to become permanently part of the intellectual lore. The magistrate's logic about his order for what he was going to release and not release was based on the legal analysis is the First Amendment and common right access to the courts, which he acknowledged that, in fact, courts have an obligation to be fully open and public and transparent to the public. That's who they're performing their duties upon or for, supposedly. And that's counterbalanced by the interest of people's legitimate interest in privacy or the court's interest in functionality. I've never quite bought into the court's interest in functionality unless it's another constitutional right, like a right to trial by jury. Otherwise, I've always found that to be very dubious, because the whole point of the court's functionality is to be open and public and transparent. And so how can there be a conflict between the court's functionality and it being open, public, and transparent? But it's an attempt to elevate the interest of the state over the interest of those who give it its authority, and from whom it needs ongoing public approval for its retained legal public legitimacy. But so that was the analysis, and ultimately the court's conclusion was that the interest in secrecy concerning sources and concerning subjects, e.g. witnesses, was sufficiently compelling enough that only a redacted warrant sufficed. That was the least the least effective means by which they could. I'm sorry, the only effective means. There was no alternative by which they could protect those public interests weighted against the public's interest in public disclosure. And so I disagree with that analysis. Now, that is a very common analysis. That analysis by the magistrate is not abnormal or deviant from judicial tradition in America. They almost never release search warrants, period. Not the applications, not the probable cause affidavit.
And we're talking pre-indictment, not post-indictment. So typically...
Yes, correct.
Okay. Now, I don't know if someone was being sarcastic in the chat where they said, come on, the redacted affidavit contained a lot of information. I don't know if they're being sarcastic or not, but look, we'll steelman it. The redacted affidavit, I think it was 95% redacted, but it had a couple of paragraphs that said, we tried to get documents back from Trump. He was not forthcoming, therefore. Now, Robert,
well, they didn't even say that, at least not in the unredacted forms. They say it's very embarrassing what they lay out as their basis. Their basis is that Trump left the White House, took documents with him. The National Archives asked for some of those documents to come back to them. Trump sent them back what they asked for to come back. When they searched what was in the documents that they got back from Trump, they considered some of the documents to be presidential records. The archives considered some of the records to be classified records or labeled classified. Based on that, the same division that did Russiagate is the same division responsible here. It's Jay Bratt, head of the counterintelligence division of the National Security Division of the FBI. It's the exact same people that ran Russiagate. It's the exact same people that covered up for Clinton. I mean, it's literally the same division and the same department within the FBI that has been in charge of all of these cases magically and miraculously. So here they are. This is the deep state. This is the heart of the deep state in federal law enforcement, is this division of people. So that my original hypothesis that this was a deep state raid is confirmed just by who was involved in it, as well as a lot of what's coming out about what was searched for and what the grounds were etc. But what they said is, so they said the archives go back through these documents. They identify some of them as presidential records. They identify some of them as classified or labeled classified. So then they reach out to Trump as to how he's guarding the other records he didn't send back. And they're secure here. There's a contract, and the Secret Service is protecting it. It had multiple locks pursuant to their request, cameras filming it at all times, consistent with their request. Yeah, exactly. We'll be getting those memes for forever. And there was no issue, essentially. I mean, the only issue was when and where the archives would fund, and there was already budgeted monies to make part of Mar-a-Lago a secure presidential library facility. So what the rest of what's unredacted is, hey, this other stuff had stuff labeled classified, so maybe there's stuff labeled classified there. Now, what's of note is there's nothing in the affidavit, the probable cause affidavit, that gives any evidence, that's at least the unredacted portion, that gives any evidence that they had any probable cause that there were records that were actually classified there. Instead, they said they were searching for presidential records without clarifying how are they making that determination, when other federal courts have already said that's a unilateral decision for the president himself to make, the former president, not the current one. And secondly, they don't say anything is classified. They say they believe there may be documents marked or labeled classified, which is not legally classified. Every document that has ever been released and declassified has the words top secret and declassified. Just go to the FBI or CIA archives. You can go right now. The information's been released through FOIA over the years. It still says classified, still says secret, still says top secret. That has no legal meaning whatsoever. So it was a bit shocking to those people who wanted to defend this raid was how weak the unredacted portion of the warrant was, because the assumption was the magistrate was unredacting part of it for the reasons you mentioned, to make himself look good. Well, this made him look like a complete crock. I mean, there was nothing in there that established probable cause to raid the records. Then you parallel that to the Trump suit filed this week. It wasn't the best. It could have been a much better, clearer lawsuit. But putting that aside, they requested a special master and a return of seized properties because they pointed out they go through the whole history as well, and they provide better history than the search warrant affidavit does. And in their history, they point out the search warrant affidavit did include as an attachment, an exhibit, a letter from Trump's lawyers pointing out there is no presidential records and none of these records are classified. They don't rebut that anywhere in the unredacted portion of the affidavit. Nowhere is that. It's extraordinary because all of these criminal statutes that people are talking about requires that the person that makes it a crime to have documents is that you are unauthorized. You're not an authorized person to have those documents. There's nothing in that affidavit that supports the idea that President Trump is not authorized to have his own records.
Well, from what we've seen, the argument would be what's under the redacted part, and how could you say that the president would not be authorized to have pretty much anything? I mean, that would be one of the arguments, is who decides. Now,
well, he's the elected head of the executive branch. So, I mean, the only thing really would be records that are right to be kept private by people, certain tax records, certain court records, but not other government-created records. In other words, records created by a government agent that don't concern other people's private information is not records that would ever be excluded from the president's right to have.
Now, let's just assume to steelman the redacted affidavit.
Just to briefly explain my point there is all of these people's authority comes from the president. So the idea that the president couldn't have those records is constitutionally absurd. That's my point. Go ahead.
Now, let's assume, to steelman this like it's nobody's business. Trump had private tax records of his political adversaries that he was going to use for blackmail. Let's assume that's the case. Would the judge have not unredacted that portion at the very least? You don't have to name the names.
Oh, right. I mean, they claim nuclear codes. There's nothing in there about that. They claim defense information. In fact, what's in the unredacted portion is just the agent saying some of this could be labeled a defense record, but doesn't identify anything. In other words, they use the records he actually gave them to claim they are records that he still had that were like the records he had already turned over. This I'd never seen. I mean, it was a terror. It's a joke. Dershowitz, I get he wants to defend his fellow Jeffrey Epstein defender, judge. I get it. You got your own conflict there, Alan.
Cheap shot, Barnes.
I get it. But him continuing to defend this magistrate is embarrassing. That this is no self-respecting criminal defense lawyer can defend this guy. This guy was that he issued it appears, by the way, according to the warrant, he issued this over WhatsApp.
Okay, I was going to ask you that.
Facebook may have actually had a copy of the search warrant.
Robert, someone noticed that. I don't know if Crypto Lawyer or was it the Umbrella guy who was the first to recognize this, signed via WhatsApp. I'm going to say what the hell, because what the hell, even when I sign a document digitally, I take a screen grab, I edit, and I use my finger on editing software. I don't go through WhatsApp, which necessarily means some entity has that. But how on earth, the magistrate is not sitting at court for this? Are they sending it to him at home? And in which case, could they not have found any other magistrate, not necessarily one who had just recused himself from a file for conflict 2 months earlier?
I don't think an honorable magistrate would have signed this warrant. Because this was so weak, unless there's something truly explosive and extraordinary in the redacted sections. The unredacted is absurdly weak. Is just and as Trump's legal claim pointed out, there was really no basis for this to be searched or seized. That the understanding of privilege was woefully inadequate in the what's in the warrant. So, they suggested there might be attorney-client privilege documents. They didn't recognize any other privilege. They didn't recognize the possibility of executive privilege. They didn't recognize the possibility of other forms of privilege that can exist between accountants, between other professionals, etc., medical records, you name it. They didn't acknowledge any of that. And the only thing they acknowledge is maybe there's attorney-client records, but we'll just have our own little taint team handle that. That's always been a crock. And so they requested a special yeah, exactly. It's appropriately named, frankly. The idea is that they won't be tainted by the investigators won't be tainted by illicitly obtained information, but that's always dubious. So they wanted a special master to review everything, but they pointed out there's much more here than attorney-client privilege. There's presidentially privileged documents, which are presumed privilege, that have to be proven to have been effectively waived, or otherwise their executive privilege protected. And so all of those records, basically all the records need to be revoked from everyone who's ever looked at them, returned to the special master. Nobody should be looking at them until and unless the special master conducts an independent review. That suit has been filed. Also, a return of it's beyond any doubt now that they seized far more documents. Not only was the search warrant already overbroad, in saying it was how are the FBI officers executing the warrant supposed to determine what is and is not a presidential record? I mean, that's not clear at all. And it's clear by what they seized, there were no limits. So they just seized everything that they thought might be between those 4-year time periods, including passports.
Well, oh God, we saw what they seized. It's everything and anything. But Robert, Trump files this motion to appoint a special master. First of all, past his prologue, we saw exactly what happened in James O'Keefe. When he got a special master, the FBI had already had the information that was the object of the special master in front of Judge Torres, but didn't tell Judge Torres that they still had access to it via other means. And so they appointed a special master, which was a subterfuge, or it was basically concealing the lie that they already had and still retained access to the very same documents. What are the chances they didn't already see everything, mirror everything, and a special master is purely illusory?
I mean, in terms of its ability to get a remedy, in that sense, that there's always that risk once they've seized it. But it's an evidence against them, their ability to ever use it in any subsequent proceeding. So that's its particular benefit. But the federal judge who's presiding over it is looking at, as already said, likely to appoint a special master. And so the media spin was, oh, that's a Trump appointee, which is interesting. The same media keeps telling us Democratic appointment doesn't mean anything, but Republican appointment is very significant when everybody knows it's been reversed, frankly, for quite some time. Republican judges will, with some degree of regularity, vote opposite their party's interest. Democratic judges never do. And so that's the other thing Dershowitz is not wanting to admit. He's not wanting to admit democratically appointed judges are hopelessly partisan biased, not wanting to admit that his fellow Epstein defense lawyer is a corrupt hack, which he is. I mean, Dershowitz still hasn't figured it out that the Rothschilds were setting him up in introducing him to Jeffrey Epstein. That he didn't. That's why he thought Jeffrey Epstein was legit. The Rothschilds introduced him to him. He still hasn't processed. That was a setup, pal. So which he still hasn't figured out yet. But the warrant is very weak in its justification. There's nothing in there that shows. They needed to show two things for probable cause. One was that Trump had documents that he was not authorized to take that fit within certain federal record requirements, presidential records and defense records. And secondly, that he knew that he had intentional, willful evidence that he was doing. They have neither. They have not, at least in the unredacted portions of the affidavit. So to the degree the magistrate was trying to show people through the unredacted portions that it was a legitimate raid, it was not. And the fact that that he clearly ignored glaring red flags just from the portions of the warrant that are unredacted that should have been red flags for him not to handle the case, for a judge to actual constitutionally appointed judge to handle the case, and for that this is a warrant that never should have been signed off on, period, and that at a minimum should have been drastically limited and restricted and shrunk. None of which he did. Of course, he shouldn't even presided over the issue over this warrant issue.
The redaction, like to decide what should remain redacted when he's
kind of conflicted by already signing off in the first place. So you're asking him to second guess his first logic, what he's never going to want to do. So I think there's always conflicts. I always think a different judge should handle the issue of a return of seized prop. Any post-warrant issue should not be handled by the same judge who signed the warrant, because it's just a conflict of institutional interest in that regard. But he, of course, was conflicted directly because he'd already recused himself. And at this point, he knew that this was a issue. Now, when Trump filed suit, he was the same magistrate magically assigned the case, but that case has to get a district court judge assigned as well. And the magistrate was basically begging for him to be assigned, and Trump said, no, thank you. And has been very critical about this magistrate and is having the judge handle the case instead, the actual constitutionally appointed judge. It looks like the judge already gave indicators the judge will grant the special master.
Yeah, but of course the judge is going. It's too late. It's purely illusory and it's useless. But Robert, the question that I was just about to ask. Darn it! Oh no, sorry. When it comes to probable cause, it requires more than an affidavit that says we have probable cause. The affidavit has to contain the facts that allow the judge to come to the conclusion that there's reasonable probable cause. So they got to allege a lot of stuff and not just say we have probable cause, rubber stamp it. Yeah. And when it comes to the warrant, it has to be this circumscribed and not a general warrant,
it needed evidence that he had committed all the elements of a crime, number one. And number two, that because it's the president, that why this was the least intrusive means under their internal rules and protocol for making the warrant reasonable. And that neither is there at all. In fact, the evidence from what Trump has filed is that they didn't have that evidence, and that this was just a desperate deep state raid to seize and steal records that are most likely embarrassing to them, that have nothing to do with even the archives referral. It's not clear the archives were actually looking to escalate this in the way this division of the FBI chose to escalate it. And for those that like people telling, it's these documents may not have been secure. Again, declassified personal records, they don't have to be secure. Secondly, that the security had already been approved of, vetted, and vouched for by the same people who raided him. Third, the Secret Service is securing it. Fourth, they'd already agreed to enhanced facilities with a payment contract for it. And last but not least, it's a lot more secure than where Bill Clinton and Barack Obama stored documents. I mean, they stored undisputably presidential records, undisputably classified records Obama had not declassified, records Obama admitted were presidential records, and they stored them in an unsecure facility in the suburbs of Chicago for months on end.
People need to understand this. This is at Mar-a-Lago. Trump is a former president, 24/7 security, already behind lock and key, paper documents.
Same Mar-a-Lago that's been considered a secure facility now for more than 4 years because it was a secure facility while he was president. This means SCIF access. This means all kinds of hyper levels of security for records.
It's preposterous. Now, I like I said on the Twitterverse, anybody who is willing to ignore the FBI, the Steele dossier, number one. They falsified evidence to try to get Trump with Carter Page. What was the other one? The Russia hoax. This is the same FBI. And now people are saying, well, they must have their reasons. I mean, you have to be totally ignorant or totally dishonest to lend the slightest bit of legitimacy to any of this. Now that you've seen the redacted or the unredacted affidavit, which, like we said, it shows nothing, not even enough. It leaves so much to guess that maybe you'll have to think the judge had good reason. It shows nothing. It's preposterous. And now they're going to make a special master when this information has already been gone through, made mirror copies of.
The risk for the special master is that you have an independent judge overseeing the proceeding that exposes the scale and severity of the misconduct, and it mucks up procedurally their ability to quickly escalate this case if they were actually ever seeking to do that. I don't think they were, but it also has that side effect. So it's a loss for the government that if a special master is appointed, but not a. It doesn't, as you note, reverse the problems of what they did.